I thought I knew what betrayal felt like until the man I loved tried to destroy everything I'd worked for because his ego couldn't handle my success. Original post. I'm still shaking as I write this, and I honestly don't know where else to turn. 3 years ago, I met someone who I thought was my person. We clicked instantly, late-night conversations, shared dreams, the whole fairy tale. He was supportive when I decided to go back to school, cheered me on through my certification program, and celebrated when I landed my dream position at a prestigious company downtown. For the first year of our relationship, everything felt perfect. He'd pick me up from work sometimes, we'd grab dinner, and he'd listen to me talk about my projects with what seemed like genuine interest. I was making decent money for the first time in my life, contributing equally to our shared expenses, and finally felt like I was building something meaningful. The shift started small. Comments about how much time I spent at the office. Questions about why I needed to attend networking events. Jokes about how I was becoming too good for him. I brushed it off as normal relationship adjustments. We were both figuring out how to balance our careers with being together. But then my company offered me a promotion. It came with a significant salary increase, my own office, and the chance to lead a team of 5 people. I was over the moon. At 28, I'd never imagined I'd reach this level so quickly. When I called him from the parking lot after getting the news, his response was lukewarm at best. He congratulated me, but something in his voice felt off. That night, instead of celebrating, we had our first real fight about my career. He said I was changing, becoming someone he didn't recognize. He complained that I talked about work too much, that I cared more about impressing my colleagues than spending time with him. I tried to explain that this opportunity meant everything to me, that I'd worked incredibly hard to get here, but he kept interrupting with complaints about how my success was affecting our relationship. Over the next few weeks, the tension only got worse. He started making snide comments about my salary in front of friends, joking that he felt like a kept man even though we split everything 50-50. He'd roll his eyes when I got excited about a project or when my boss complimented my work. The man who used to encourage my ambitions was now making me feel guilty for having them. The breaking point came 3 months into my new role. My team had just completed a major project that saved the company a substantial amount of money. My boss was so impressed that she recommended me for a company-wide recognition program. It meant a bonus, a feature in the internal newsletter, and consideration for an even higher position within the year. When I got home that evening, practically floating with excitement, I found him sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop closed and his arms crossed. I started telling him about my day, about the recognition, about how proud I was of my team's work. He let me finish, then looked me straight in the eye and said the words that still make my stomach turn. He told me he couldn't handle this anymore. That my success was making him look like a failure to his friends and family. That everywhere we went, people asked about my job, my achievements, my next steps, and he felt invisible. He said watching me succeed was destroying his self-esteem and making him question his own worth as a man. Then came the ultimatum that changed everything. He wanted me to quit. Not just the promotion, the entire job. He had it all figured out. I could find something part-time, something that wouldn't be so demanding or high-profile. We could start a family sooner, and I could focus on being supportive of his career goals instead of being so focused on my own. I stared at him in complete disbelief. This was the same person who had held me while I cried during those late-night study sessions, who had told me he was proud of how hard I worked, who had said he loved my ambition. Now he was asking me to throw it all away because my success made him uncomfortable. I told him I needed time to think, which only made him angrier. He accused me of choosing my job over our relationship, of being selfish and career-obsessed. He said if I really loved him, this wouldn't even be a question. The conversation ended with him storming out to stay at his friend's place, leaving me alone with the crushing realization that the person I thought I'd spend my life with saw my dreams as a threat to his masculinity. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation we'd had about my career, looking for signs I'd missed. Had he always felt this way? Was I really being selfish for wanting to build something meaningful with my life? Part of me wondered if he was right, if I was becoming someone different, someone harder to love. But then I thought about all the nights I'd worked late not because I had to, but because I genuinely loved what I was doing. I thought about my team, how they looked to me for guidance and support. I thought about the young women in my department who saw me as proof that they could advance in their careers too. Was I supposed to give all of that up because the man I loved couldn't celebrate my success? The next morning, he came back with flowers and an apology, but not the kind I needed. He was sorry for how he'd said it, not for what he'd said. He still wanted me to quit, just hoped we could discuss it more calmly. He kept emphasizing how much he loved me, how he wanted to build a life together, but couldn't do it while feeling like he was living in my shadow. I realized then that this wasn't really about my job at all. It was about control, about his need to be the primary breadwinner, the one with the impressive career story. My success challenged some fundamental belief he had about how our relationship should work, and instead of examining that belief, he wanted me to shrink myself to make him comfortable. As I'm writing this, he's given me a week to decide. A week to choose between the career I've built and the relationship I thought was everything. He's convinced that if I really love him, the choice should be obvious. But what he doesn't understand is that by asking me to make this choice at all, he's already shown me exactly how much he values me as a person versus me as a girlfriend who makes him feel good about himself. I keep going back and forth between anger and heartbreak. 3 years feels like a long time to walk away from, especially when I genuinely believed we had a future together. But I also can't imagine looking back in 10 years and wondering what my life could have been if I'd chosen differently. Has anyone else been in a situation like this? How do you know when to fight for a relationship and when to walk away? I feel so lost right now, and I could really use some perspective from people who might understand what I'm going through. Update 1-2 weeks later. I want to thank everyone who responded to my original post. The support from strangers on the internet meant more than I can express, especially since I felt so isolated in my real life. Your comments helped me see things more clearly during a time when I was drowning in doubt and confusion. I didn't quit my job. But what happened next was something I never could have predicted. After posting here, I spent several days really thinking about the relationship patterns I'd been ignoring. I started noticing things that had become so normal I'd stopped seeing them as red flags. Like how he always managed to steer conversations away from my work accomplishments. How he'd schedule things during important networking events I'd mentioned, then act hurt when I chose the events over his plans. How he'd gotten increasingly comfortable making jokes about my salary and success in front of others, always framed as harmless teasing but designed to diminish my achievements. I decided to test something. Instead of avoiding the topic of work like I'd been doing to keep the peace, I started being intentionally open about my career again. I talked about my projects, shared exciting developments, mentioned my team's successes. His reactions were even worse than I remembered. Eye-rolling, subject changes, condescending comments about how I was becoming obsessed with status and money. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. During one of these conversations, he made a comment that stopped me cold. He said something about how I needed to be careful not to get too big for my britches, that companies like mine were always looking for reasons to get rid of people who got too comfortable in their positions. The way he said it wasn't caring or protective, it was almost gleeful, like he was hoping something would happen to knock me down a peg. That comment stuck with me for days. Why would someone who claimed to love me seem happy at the possibility of my professional downfall? It was like he wanted me to fail so he could be right about me needing to quit. A week later, I found out why. I was working late one Thursday evening when I got a call from my boss asking me to come to her office. My stomach dropped immediately. Late-night meetings with management are never good news. When I got there, she had a serious expression that made my heart race. She told me that someone had called the company's anonymous tip line making allegations about my conduct. According to the caller, I was supposedly sharing confidential company information with competitors, inflating my project results to make myself look better, and creating a hostile work environment for my team members. The allegations were detailed and specific enough that the company was required to launch a formal investigation. I was devastated. In 3 years with the company, I'd never had so much as a minor performance issue. My team respected me, my projects were successful, and I'd never even considered sharing confidential information with anyone, let alone competitors. But I also knew that in today's corporate environment, allegations like these had to be taken seriously, regardless of how baseless they seemed. My boss assured me that I wasn't being fired or suspended, but I would need to step back from some of my responsibilities while they investigated. She also mentioned that whoever made the report seemed to have detailed knowledge about my specific projects and team dynamics, suggesting it was someone with inside information about my work life. As I drove home that night, my mind was racing. Who would want to sabotage my career like this? I'd always gotten along well with my colleagues, and while there might be some natural competition for promotions, I couldn't think of anyone who would go this far. My team members seemed happy with my leadership style, and I'd never had any serious conflicts with other department heads. Then it hit me like a physical blow. The allegations weren't just random attacks on my character, they were specifically designed to target the exact aspects of my success that he'd been complaining about for months. The tip mentioned my project results, my leadership style, my relationships with colleagues. Things that someone would only know if they'd been listening to my work stories for years and taking notes about what would be most damaging to report. But I couldn't believe it. Even with all our problems, even with his demands that I quit, I couldn't imagine that the person I'd shared my bed with for 3 years would actively try to destroy my career. It felt too cruel, too calculated, too far beyond what even our worst fights had prepared me for. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I started paying closer attention to his questions about my work. What had previously seemed like normal relationship conversation now felt different. When he asked about specific project details, was he genuinely interested or gathering information? When he encouraged me to vent about challenging team dynamics, was he being supportive or looking for ammunition? The investigation took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of walking into an office where everyone knew something was wrong but couldn't talk about it. 2 weeks of watching my team wonder why I wasn't leading our morning meetings anymore. 2 weeks of second-guessing every decision I'd made and every relationship I'd built. During those 2 weeks, his behavior at home became even stranger. He kept asking how the situation at work was going, but not in a way that felt supportive. It was more like he was monitoring the progress of something he'd set in motion. When I told him I was stressed about the investigation, he'd make comments about how maybe this was a sign that I should consider other options anyway. The worst part was that I started doubting myself. When you're under investigation, even for false allegations, you begin questioning everything. Had I been too demanding as a leader? Had I inadvertently shared information I shouldn't have? Was I really as good at my job as I thought, or had I been fooling myself all along? But my team came through for me in ways I never expected. Without being asked, 3 of them went to management to provide statements about my leadership and conduct. They talked about how I'd supported their professional development, how I'd never asked them to do anything unethical, how I'd actually improved their work environment since taking over the team. My project results were easy to verify, and when the company audited my communications, they found no evidence of any information sharing with competitors. The investigation concluded that the allegations were completely unfounded. Not just unproven, actively contradicted by evidence and witness statements. My boss apologized for what I'd gone through and assured me that my position was secure and my reputation intact. She also mentioned that they'd traced the tip line call, and while they couldn't release details, they determined it came from someone with no legitimate connection to the company. Someone with no connection to the company, but detailed knowledge of my work life. Someone who would benefit from me losing faith in my career. Someone who had been pushing me to quit for months and might have decided to speed up the process. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of confronting him directly, I set up a test. I told him about a fake work situation, a fictional conflict with a colleague that I made up entirely. I included specific details about supposed project problems and team issues. Then I waited. 3 days later, my boss called me again. Another anonymous tip had come in, this time about the exact fictional situation I'd described to him. Same anonymous tip line, same detailed knowledge that could only have come from someone I'd told personally. I finally had proof of what I'd suspected but couldn't bring myself to believe. The person I loved, the person who claimed he wanted to build a life with me, had been actively sabotaging my career in hopes of forcing me to quit. He hadn't just asked me to choose between him and my job, he'd tried to make that choice for me by destroying my professional reputation. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't even process it emotionally at first. This wasn't a moment of jealousy or a mistake made in anger. This was a deliberate, sustained campaign to undermine everything I'd worked for. And he'd been doing it while holding me at night, while making plans for our future, while pretending to support me through the stress he was causing. I'm writing this update from my sister's apartment across town. I packed my things while he was at work and left a note explaining that I knew what he'd done. I didn't give him a chance to explain or apologize because there's no explanation that could make this okay. You don't sabotage someone's career and then claim you love them. You don't try to destroy someone's dreams and call it caring. The hardest part isn't even the breakup, it's realizing how long he'd been planning this. How many of our conversations about my career had been fishing expeditions for information he could use against me. How many times he'd comforted me about work stress while secretly being the source of that stress. My company's legal department has been incredibly supportive. While they can't pursue criminal charges since no actual damage was done to the company, they've documented everything in case he tries to target my workplace again. My boss has also assured me that this incident won't affect my career trajectory there, and she's been amazing about helping me process what happened professionally. But personally, I feel like I'm starting over from scratch. 3 years of my life with someone who turned out to be willing to destroy my dreams to protect his ego. I keep wondering what other things he might have sabotaged that I don't even know about. Professional connections, friendships, opportunities, how much of my life was being manipulated without my knowledge? The silver lining, if there is one, is that I'm absolutely certain I made the right choice. Anyone who could do what he did isn't someone I could ever trust again, with my career or anything else. My job is still there, my team still respects me, and I still love what I do. He tried to take that away from me and failed. I'm scared about dating again, about trusting someone new with the vulnerable parts of my life. But I'm also relieved to be free of someone who saw my success as a threat instead of a celebration. For the first time in months, I can talk about my work without walking on eggshells or worrying about someone's reaction. Next week, I'm starting the process for that higher position my boss mentioned before all this happened. I'm terrified and excited and proud of myself for not letting his sabotage derail my dreams. Maybe that's the best revenge, succeeding despite his best efforts to make me fail. Update 2 1 month later. The responses to my last update have been overwhelming, and I want to thank everyone who shared their own stories of workplace sabotage and relationship betrayal. It's been both heartbreaking and comforting to know I'm not alone in experiencing this kind of manipulation. A lot of people asked what happened after I left, whether he tried to contact me, and how I've been handling the aftermath. The short answer is that things got much more complicated than I expected, but also revealed just how deep his deception went. For the first week after I left, he didn't contact me at all. I thought maybe he was too ashamed or angry to reach out, or perhaps he was relieved that I'd made the decision to leave so he didn't have to keep pretending to want me to stay. I was staying at my sister's place, trying to figure out my next steps and process what had happened. Then the calls started. Not from him directly, but from mutual friends who had been contacted by him with a very different version of events. According to his story, I had been acting paranoid and unstable for weeks, accusing him of things he'd never done. He told people that I'd been under investigation at work for legitimate performance issues, and instead of taking responsibility, I'd decided to blame him for my problems. He painted himself as the long-suffering boyfriend of someone who had become obsessed with work and success to the point of losing touch with reality. The most painful part was discovering how many people believed him without question. Friends I'd known for years were suddenly distant when I tried to explain what had really happened. Some of them seemed to think I'd had some kind of breakdown, that the stress of my job had made me paranoid and delusional. Others clearly felt like they needed to choose sides and had chosen his. What hurt most was realizing that his campaign against me hadn't started with the anonymous tips to my company. He'd been subtly undermining my credibility with our social circle for months, maybe longer. Those jokes about my career obsession, those comments about how success was changing me, those concerns about my work-life balance, they weren't just private relationship issues. He'd been sharing these concerns with our friends, laying the groundwork for this exact situation. When I finally understood the scope of what he'd done, I felt like I was drowning. It wasn't just that he'd tried to sabotage my career, he'd systematically isolated me from our support network by convincing them that I was the unstable one in the relationship. If I tried to tell people what he'd really done, it would sound exactly like the paranoid accusations he'd already told them I was making. I spent several days feeling completely hopeless. How do you fight back against someone who's been planning your downfall for months while pretending to love you? How do you prove your sanity to people who've already been convinced you've lost it? But then something unexpected happened that changed everything. I got a message from someone I barely knew, a woman who had dated him about 4 years ago, before I met him. She'd heard through mutual connections about our breakup and his version of events, and something about his story had triggered memories she'd tried to forget. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and during that conversation, I learned that I wasn't his first victim. According to her, their relationship had followed a remarkably similar pattern. At first, he'd been supportive of her career in marketing. But as she started succeeding in her field, getting promotions and recognition, his behavior changed. He became critical of her ambition, jealous of her achievements, and eventually started making the same demands about scaling back her career to focus on their relationship. But when she refused to quit her job, things escalated in ways that made my experience look mild by comparison. He'd started by spreading rumors among their friends about her being difficult and career-obsessed. Then he'd moved on to directly interfering with her work. He'd shown up at her office claiming to be concerned about her mental health, telling her colleagues that she'd been acting erratically at home. He'd called her boss pretending to be a concerned friend, suggesting that she might be struggling with substance abuse and needed professional help. The campaign had been so effective that she'd eventually been forced to leave her job and start over in a different city just to escape the professional damage he'd caused. She'd never been able to prove what he'd done, and by the time she'd figured out the scope of his sabotage, her reputation in her industry was already destroyed. Hearing her story was like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own experience. The same manipulation tactics, the same systematic destruction of credibility, the same calculated cruelty disguised as concern. But it also gave me something I desperately needed: proof that I wasn't crazy, and evidence of a pattern that went far beyond what had happened to me. She still had documentation from their relationship, text messages, emails, records of his visits to her workplace. More importantly, she'd kept in touch with some of their mutual friends from that time, people who had eventually realized they'd been manipulated and felt guilty about how they'd treated her. Together, we started reaching out to people in his life, both from his relationship with her and from his relationship with me. What we discovered was a pattern of behavior that went back at least 6 years and possibly longer. There had been another woman between her and me, someone who had also experienced career sabotage during their relationship. Her situation had been different. She'd been a teacher, and he'd made anonymous complaints to her school district about her conduct with students. The allegations had been investigated and found baseless, but the stress had caused her to have a nervous breakdown that ended her teaching career. We also found out that his interference in my career hadn't been limited to the anonymous tips. He'd been much busier than I'd realized. Through careful investigation and some help from friends in the industry, we discovered that he'd been contacting people in my professional network for months. He'd reached out to former colleagues, networking contacts, even people I'd met at industry events, always with the same story about being concerned about my mental health and professional conduct. Most of these people had ignored his contacts or found them strange, but some had been influenced by his apparent sincerity and intimate knowledge of my work life. He'd presented himself as a loving boyfriend who was worried about my well-being and hoped someone could convince me to seek help. The most devastating discovery was that he'd contacted the mentor who had recommended me for my current position. He'd told her that I'd been struggling with paranoia and delusions of persecution, that I'd been making up stories about workplace conflicts that didn't exist. He'd suggested that she might want to check in with my current employer to make sure I was receiving the support I needed. Fortunately, my mentor had found his contact inappropriate and hadn't acted on his suggestions. But knowing that he'd tried to poison that relationship, one of the most important professional connections in my life, made me realize just how comprehensively he'd been working to destroy my career. Armed with this information and documentation from his previous victims, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of trying to defend myself against his lies, I went on the offensive. I compiled everything we'd learned about his pattern of behavior and shared it with our mutual friends, not as desperate self-defense, but as a warning about someone who had hurt multiple women in the same systematic way. I included documentation, timelines, and corroborating evidence from his previous relationships. The response was immediate and dramatic. People who had been distant suddenly reached out to apologize and offer support. Friends who had believed his version of events were horrified to learn about the scope of his manipulation. Several people admitted that they'd found his stories about me strange but hadn't known what to make of them at the time. More importantly, exposing his pattern of behavior made it clear that this wasn't about me being unstable or paranoid. This was about him being a predator who targeted successful women and systematically destroyed their careers and reputations when they refused to subordinate themselves to his ego. The social consequences for him have been severe. Most of our mutual friends have cut contact with him completely. His behavior has become something of a cautionary tale in our social circles, and several people have warned their female friends to be careful around him. But the most satisfying consequence has been professional. It turns out that his own career wasn't as stable as he'd pretended. When word got out about his pattern of sabotaging women's careers, it reached people in his professional network as well. His industry is smaller and more interconnected than he'd realized, and his behavior toward me and his previous partners reflected poorly on his character and judgment. I don't know all the details, but I've heard through mutual connections that he's had some significant professional setbacks recently. It seems that when you make a habit of destroying other people's reputations, you eventually develop a reputation of your own. As for me, I'm doing better than I ever imagined possible. The support from friends who now understand what really happened has been incredible. My career is not just back on track but accelerating. My boss fast-tracked my promotion after learning about what I'd been dealing with, and I've received several offers from other companies who were impressed by how I handled the situation. Most surprisingly, connecting with his other victims has led to some of the most meaningful friendships I've ever had. We understand each other in ways that people who haven't experienced this kind of manipulation simply can't. We've become each other's support system and advocates, and we're working on ways to help other women recognize and escape similar situations. I'm also in a completely different place emotionally. For months, I'd been questioning my own judgment, wondering if I was really as difficult and career-obsessed as he claimed. Now I understand that his criticism of my ambition wasn't about me at all, it was about his inability to handle a partner who wasn't dependent on his approval for her sense of self-worth. The woman who was ready to consider quitting her dream job to save a relationship doesn't exist anymore. In her place is someone who knows exactly what she's worth and won't tolerate anyone trying to diminish that worth for their own comfort. I haven't heard from him directly since I left, though I know through mutual friends that he's attempted to reach out through intermediaries. I have no interest in giving him a chance to manipulate or gaslight me further. There's nothing he could say that would change what he did, and no apology that could repair the trust he destroyed. Looking back, I think the most important thing I've learned is that when someone shows you who they are through their actions, you should believe them the first time. All the red flags I rationalized, all the concerning behaviors I made excuses for, all the times my gut told me something was wrong, I should have listened to those instincts instead of giving him the benefit of the doubt. But I'm also grateful for how this experience has changed me. I'm stronger now, more aware of manipulation tactics, more protective of my own interests and boundaries. I know what healthy support looks like versus what controlling behavior disguised as concern looks like. Most importantly, I know that my success isn't something I need to apologize for or minimize to make other people comfortable. Next month, I'm starting my new position, leading a larger team and taking on responsibilities I'd only dreamed about a year ago. I'm also planning to move into my own apartment, something I'm incredibly excited about after months of staying with family and friends. For anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, please trust your instincts. If someone who claims to love you is asking you to make yourself smaller, less successful, less ambitious for their comfort, that's not love, that's control. Real love celebrates your achievements and supports your dreams, even when they're intimidating or challenging. And if you're being systematically undermined by someone you trust, know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. Document everything, reach out for help, and don't let anyone convince you that your success is something to be ashamed of. I never thought I'd be grateful for the worst betrayal of my life, but in many ways, it saved me from wasting more years with someone who saw my potential as a threat instead of a gift. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be exactly what you needed to become who you were meant to be. Final update 3 months later. I've been hesitant to write this final update because I wasn't sure I wanted to keep reliving this chapter of my life, but so many people have asked for closure that I feel like I owe it to everyone who supported me through this journey. The last 3 months have brought developments I never could have anticipated, some wonderful and some deeply disturbing. But overall, I'm writing this from a place of genuine happiness and security that I wasn't sure I'd ever reach again. First, the professional updates. My new position has exceeded every expectation I had. Leading a larger team has been challenging but incredibly rewarding, and I've discovered leadership skills I didn't know I possessed. The project we completed last month resulted in the largest cost savings in my department's history, and I've been nominated for a company-wide excellence award that comes with both recognition and a substantial bonus. More importantly, I love going to work every day. After months of walking on eggshells and second-guessing every decision, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely passionate about my career. Now I remember why I worked so hard to get here in the first place, and I'm excited about the possibilities ahead of me. I also moved into my own apartment, and I can't describe how liberating it's been to create a space that's entirely mine. For the first time in my adult life, I'm living completely independently, making all my own decisions about everything from furniture to weekend plans. It's been both scary and exhilarating, but mostly just peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced before. The friendship I developed with his previous victims has become one of the most valuable relationships in my life. We've created an informal support network that extends beyond just the three of us. We're in contact with several other women who've experienced similar manipulation, and we've become resources for each other in ways that traditional support systems couldn't match. Together, we've also done something I'm incredibly proud of. We've created a private online forum where women can share their experiences with manipulative partners and get advice from people who understand the specific tactics used by men who target successful women. It's grown to include over 100 members, and we've helped several women recognize and escape situations similar to ours before they escalated to career sabotage. But the most unexpected development has been romantic. I'd assumed it would be years before I trusted anyone enough to date again, but life had other plans. 2 months ago, I met someone at an industry conference who completely challenged my assumptions about relationships and ambition. He approached me after a panel I'd participated in about leadership in crisis situations, and instead of the usual networking conversation, he wanted to talk about the substance of my presentation. What struck me immediately was that he was genuinely excited about my professional achievements. Not threatened, not intimidated, not trying to minimize them with jokes or redirect the conversation, actually excited. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, shared relevant experiences from his own career, and treated my success as something to be celebrated rather than managed. We started as professional contacts, grabbing coffee to discuss industry trends and sharing resources for our respective teams. But gradually, I realized I was looking forward to our conversations in a way that went beyond professional networking. He was brilliant and funny and kind, but more than that, he made me feel like the best version of myself rather than a version I needed to tone down for someone else's comfort. The first time he asked me out for a non-work dinner, I panicked. I'd gotten so used to protecting myself from manipulation that the idea of being vulnerable with someone new felt terrifying. But I also realized that if I let my ex's behavior prevent me from ever trusting again, he would have succeeded in diminishing my life even after I'd escaped his direct influence. Dating someone new has been a revelation in terms of understanding what healthy relationship dynamics actually look like. When I talk about my work, he listens with genuine interest and asks follow-up questions. When I get excited about a project or achievement, he gets excited too. When I face challenges at work, he offers support without trying to use those challenges as evidence that I should consider a different path. Most importantly, he seems to understand that my career success isn't something that happens despite our relationship, it's part of what makes me who I am, and therefore part of what he values about me. The contrast with my previous relationship has been so stark that I sometimes wonder how I ever thought the other dynamic was normal or acceptable. But this update isn't just about my recovery and new relationship. There have also been some developments regarding my ex that I feel obligated to share, both as closure for this story and as a warning for others. About 6 weeks ago, I received a call from a detective with the local police department. It turns out that his pattern of behavior toward women had attracted official attention, though not in the way I'd expected. The teacher whose career he'd destroyed had never stopped investigating what had happened to her. Over the years, she'd quietly documented his involvement in the anonymous complaints against her and gathered evidence of his broader pattern of targeting successful women. When she learned about what he'd done to me and his other victims, she decided to pursue legal action. While relationship manipulation isn't typically a criminal matter, his actions had crossed several legal lines. The false complaints he'd made to my company and to the teacher's school district constituted filing false reports. His impersonation of concerned friends when contacting our professional networks could be considered fraud. Most seriously, his systematic campaign to destroy our careers met the legal definition of stalking and harassment in our state. The detective was calling because they were building a case and wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about my experiences. They also wanted to know if I had any documentation of his behavior that could support the charges. I was conflicted about getting involved in a legal case. Part of me just wanted to move on with my life and leave the past behind. But I also thought about other women who might encounter him in the future, and about how his escalating pattern of behavior suggested he wouldn't stop unless there were real consequences. I decided to cooperate with the investigation, as did his other victims. The evidence we provided painted a clear picture of predatory behavior that had been escalating over several years. More importantly, the investigation uncovered additional victims we hadn't known about, including women from other cities where he'd lived previously. The case went to court last month, and he was convicted on multiple charges related to filing false reports and criminal harassment. He received a sentence that includes both jail time and probation, during which he's prohibited from contacting any of his victims and required to attend counseling specifically focused on controlling and manipulative behavior. I won't pretend that seeing him convicted solved all my emotional trauma from the relationship. Legal justice doesn't undo the months of gaslighting and self-doubt he put me through. But there was something profoundly validating about having